the record. All right. So as I said, density independent population growth, and we're going to be building on this in the context of evolution by natural selection. So I'm going to share my screen. I want to start by reminding you about these 4 premises or preconditions for evolution by natural selection. We want you to think about the things that we talk about in class in relation to these 4 ideas. And when all 4 are met, the consequence for our population is evolution by natural selection. So we'll be thinking a little bit about number 3 today as we go. All right, so our objectives today are to make sure you all understand these terms: birth rate, death rate, geometric rate of increase, those sorts of things. We want you to understand what this term tells us about population growth, the geometric rate of increase. And we're going to talk about these population growth equations, and you'll be able to calculate the number of individuals in a population at a given time if you have a good understanding of these terms. We'll want you to be able to state the assumptions of a model that shows population growing exponentially. There are other ways populations can grow, and we might fit other models to those patterns of growth. So each model works under a series of assumptions, and we're going to talk about what those are for this particular model. And then we're going to discuss how this model fits into natural selection. So let's start with some terminology. If you did the reading, you might recognize this definition of what a population is. So we're talking about population growth. Let's understand what a population is. And a general definition that works reasonably well from Smith and Smith is a group of individuals of the same species that inhabit a given area for a given interval of time. The population begins and it grows and persists for some time, maybe has other fluctuations, and then maybe ceases to exist. Maybe they go extinct at some point. But the population is in a given area. So one of the points, the second one down here, is a defined spatial boundary. That's what we mean by an area. And usually those boundaries might correspond to real boundaries in the world, like the shoreline of an island, for example. But really from the perspective of the population that's growing and not necessarily the scientist who's measuring the population or sampling it, there has to be some potential for interbreeding or genetic connectivity among the individuals. So 2 individuals in a population on the same island or in the same patch of forest have the potential to interbreed, whether they do or not. And even if they don't really have the potential to interbreed, they might be part of a general population within which there might be some gene flow. So maybe they are, maybe we're talking about finches that are adapted to large and small beak sizes. And so if they're accessing different foods, they might not interbreed, but over the course of several generations, there might be some exchange of genes among grandparents and great-grandchildren. So there's some genetic connectivity there. And that's what we mean by a population. The same area, but that there's this potential for interbreeding. There's some genetic connectivity among the individuals in a population.
Yeah, I generally think of this as you're more likely to exchange genes with a member of your own population than you're likely to exchange genes with a member of some other population.
And that boundary is sometimes quite sharp. Sometimes it's a little bit fuzzier. But we're going to think of it as reasonably sharp. So now that we know what a population is, the question is, what do we mean by population growth? And I wonder if somebody can tell me what processes might influence how the size of a population of organisms might change over time.
Immigration.
There you go. So migration, and that can be divided up into immigration and emigration, right? Individuals coming into the area or going out of the population. That was Connor. Someone else?
Birth rate and death rate.
So is it the rate that brings individuals in, or is it the actual process of births and deaths?
I guess the process.
Yeah, right? I mean, you've got a population at some time and there's some births, and now the population is bigger because there were some births. Now you can calculate the birth rate, which is what we're going to do, but good. And who was that? My little highlighter thing didn't show up. Was that Grant?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. All right. So we can depict that graphically here. So if this letter N represents the number of individuals in a population, then births are, importing individuals into the population from nowhere, right? From whatever they were before they were individuals of your population, whatever their biomass was. And immigration is going to bring individuals into your population as well, whereas immigration and deaths are removing individuals. And these four are pretty easy to remember. I mean, they're paired, but you can remember this this little acronym BIDE: birth, immigration, death, and immigration. So if these are the four basic categories of processes that can affect population size, what do you think we might mean if we talk about a closed population?
There's no immigration and immigration, just birth and death.
Good, yep. And who was that? I gotta fix my little speaker view here because it's not jumping around for me.
It's Paula.
Thanks. Oh yeah, thanks, Paula. There we go. Now I should see it better. Good. So for the problem we're going to do today, we're going to assume a closed population, and our population is going to be Pinta Island tortoises. This is going to be a population of hybrid tortoises that were reintroduced to Pinta Island. So this is the island of Pinta in the Galapagos. I've sort of cropped the map here, but there's the main large island. Do you guys think that having a closed population for the tortoises is a reasonable assumption? I'm seeing some nods. Good. Is it strictly true that it's a fully closed population? Thanks, Joe. I saw that. No, Dominic. Do you guys know anything about the natural history of tortoises that would suggest that even though it's a reasonable assumption, it's not strictly true?
Didn't we talk about them like migrating across oceans and stuff at one point?
We did. We talked about the Aldabra tortoise that was washed out to sea and stayed alive because it's a tortoise and they have slow metabolisms, and as long as they've got a good diet, they can kind of drift around for a while and survive. And if chance happens to take them to an island, then they'll make it. But that's a rare event. It's rare for the tortoises to get washed out by a freak storm, and it's rare for them, again, to then land somewhere where they can survive. So we treat that as a reasonable assumption. So a little bit of background on Pinta Island. In 2003, goats were eradicated from the island, and goats were probably the most important herbivores on the island at that point. They were eating all the leaves and all the shrubs and the trees and everything like that. And there was an effort to recolonize the island with tortoises, bring back that tortoise population. But it had to be done using hybrid tortoises that were similar to, and when I say hybrid, I mean hybrids among other Galapagos Island tortoises, so that you get the morphology that's appropriate. And I'll show you what I mean there. They wanted to repopulate the island not just with any tortoises, but with these saddleback tortoises, or with the tortoises with the high front of the shell. That was the kind of tortoise they wanted to repopulate it with, because these tortoises can reach up higher for different kinds of vegetation. So they eradicated goats, but then they needed to bring the tortoises back to manage the vegetation, because once they removed the goats, all the plants went crazy. They grew and had no herbivores controlling their populations. So there's plenty of food and resources for the tortoises. And they introduced, for this example, we'll say they introduced 15 male and 15 female tortoises to sort of restore the Pinta Island population with a close approximation of what was there when Darwin visited so many years ago. So 2010, they introduced this new population. And then they checked back by May 2011, a bunch of stuff had happened. And that included 7 tortoises were born and 1 tortoise had died. So if we started with 2010 population, where were we at in 2011?
36.
Yeah, Ryan? Good, so probably this is the math you did. 30 is this value NT, so that's the population size at time 0. That's the initial population in 2010. Then you added 7, and you subtracted 1, and you got 36 for a year later, T plus 1, 2011. So population size, births, and deaths for a given time. Now what I want you to do is calculate the per capita birth rates and death rates from those raw birth and death values. Anyone tell me what per capita means? Anyone know?
I think it's like per individual.
Yeah, that's exactly what it means, and it comes from the Latin per head. So capita refers to the head, and most animals only have 1 head. So we can go with per capita as an estimate of individuals. So notice it's not time, right? It's per individuals. What did you guys get for the per capita birth rate?
0.23.
Yep, good. And someone else, the death rate?
0.03.
Good, the death rate, exactly. Devin. All right, so a little bit of a problem to work through here that takes a few steps. If those per capita birth and death rates are constant, what would you expect the population to be in 2013?
48.
Does that sound good to everyone? See some nods? Yeah, good. So it takes a few steps to get there, right? You got to do 2011, and you got to do 2012, and you got to do 2013. If I asked you for 2020, what are they right now? You know, that it might take you a little while to get through all of that. So before we show you the shortcut, let's go through a couple other terms. There's this value capital R that I want you to see. And this is calculated using that birth rate minus the death rate. What do you get if you subtract B minus D?
Six.
Remember, this is the little, so good point here, this is the lowercase b and the lowercase d. So if we go back here, it's this lowercase b and lowercase d that I'm asking about and subtracting. Not actually the raw birth rate and death. No, not actually the raw births and deaths.
And it'd be 0.20.
Yeah, there you go. 0.02 or 0.20, exactly. Okay, and the other term that we're going to define here is this finite rate of increase. You heard me call it the geometric rate of increase earlier out of habit, but I want to clarify something here. You'll see it both as the finite rate of increase and the geometric rate of increase. Typically, we use the geometric rate of increase when we're dealing with geometric growth models. And we're actually going to get beyond that in just a moment, because the geometric growth model is usually used for organisms that have pulses of reproduction and where the generations don't overlap. But how long does a Galapagos Island tortoise live?
Very
Like year or two.
They can, yeah, I heard someone say very long. Yeah, these things live, Lonesome George was, what was he in his 80s? They estimated him being born in the late 1800s. And I think when he died, he was over 100 years old. Yeah, his birth was an estimate, I think it was 1800s. And over the course of that time, he was sexually mature for most of his life. So presumably he had many offspring. Unfortunately, the Pinta Island tortoise population was declining, and he was the last one on Pinta Island of his population. But it turned out he had close relatives that would have been descendants or descendants of his close relatives on other islands. So there may be some Pinta Island tortoise genes still out there. Anyway, tortoises don't have pulses of reproduction with non-overlapping generations. Their generations overlap. So we can use a more continuous model, and that's why I'm going to avoid this geometric rate of increase term and instead use this value as the finite rate of increase. Finite meaning we're defining what a time step is, 1 year. Right? We started with 2010, we went to 2011, that's a finite time. So these two things are related through a pretty simple equation. 1 plus r equals the finite rate of increase. So what does that give us for the finite rate of increase value?
$1.2.
Yeah. And does anyone calculate the ratio of 36 to 30? N sub t plus 1 to nt? It's all interconnected.
1.2.
Yep. All right. So it's basically the ratio from one time step to the previous one. That's what this finite rate of increase value is. So then you can ask yourself, what does the finite rate of increase and its value tell you about population growth in general? You can make predictions. So if we were to say that the finite rate of increase is greater than 1, what's happening to the population? And what's the relationship between the value for B and the value for D?
The population's increasing, so B is greater than D.
Good. And if it's less than 1, Katie?
Decreasing, and D is less or greater than B.
D is greater than B. Yeah, correct. And in this case, the special case where the finite rate of increase is equal to 1,
The population is the same. B and D are equal.
yeah, then you'll get turnover of individuals through time, but the total value of n, population size, stays constant. Good. So I told you that the tortoises have long periods of sexual maturity, and we can model the population growth as continuous instead of discrete, going from 1 year to another, right? We went to May 2011. What if you wanted to know about January or March? So what we did before, we had this T1 and T2, 2011 and 2010, and the change in time there is 1 year. And a bunch of stuff happened, right? Births and deaths might happen over the course of that time. And then you get an increase in 6 individuals. So you go up 6 here. But you can change this time unit, make it longer or shorter. And if you make it so short that it's effectively 0, so the change in time approaches 0, then you can get a tangent line that intersects the population growth curve only at that point, that point in time and interest that you have. Notice that this tangent line is kind of similar to if you just calculate the slope of a line connecting these 2 points, but you're bringing those 2 points closer and closer together on the curve. I've given you guys calculus flashbacks. So this is the tangent line that we're looking for. So we can look at the rate of change at any moment in time, which is effectively the slope of the tangent line. And we refer to that as dn by dt. This is the instantaneous growth rate, the slope of the tangent line. So if you want to calculate the if you want to describe a population's growth and how that rate of growth might change as the slope of the tangent line changes, this is the equation we use. There's a parameter here called little r. You multiply that by the population size, and that gives you the rate of change of population growth. If we integrate that, then you can calculate the population size at any time t if you know the initial population size. In the case of the tortoises, it's 30, right? And you know the value for little r in your population. Does anyone remember? Oh, it has it on here. Remember that e is a constant, right? It's this 2.718 value that continues on, but you can just know 2.718. So this e value is a constant. And your variables are effectively the y-axis is the population size you want to predict, and the x-axis is t for time. So if it helps you to remember, the variables are going to be your x and your y. That's t and n sub t. The initial population size is a constant. That's kind of like a parameter in your model. And the population growth parameter is this value r. And of course, e is constant. So this is the way that you can calculate population size for any time under a continuous model of population growth. So you don't have to go year by year like we just did for 2013. Any questions about these two equations? Seem okay? So how do we get from the finite rate of increase to this instantaneous rate of increase? Well, under certain conditions, which is we're meeting here, a simple exponential growth rate model in a closed population, you can convert between these two. The finite rate of increase is equal to the natural log of r, or the finite rate of increase is equal to e 2.718 raised to this value r. So if you know one, you can figure out the other. So given that, can someone tell me what the value is for r for a continuous population growth of Pinta Island tortoises?
0.182.
Yeah. Good. Great. So if you know that, someone else tell me what the population should be in 2030. So now we know about the 2010, 2011 initial colonization. What's it going to be 10 years from now under this model?
One 1,142.
Good. Does that sound like the number of tortoises that you might find if you were to visit? Does that sound like a reasonable estimate for the number of tortoises if you were to visit Pinta Island in 10 years? You saw the map of how small Pinta Island is.
I think it'd be too many tortoises on the island for them to survive, so you'd actually have a more death rate increase.
Yeah.
Or just migration.
Right. And if we kept going, right, if we noticed the shape of the curve, if we went out from 20 years, initially the increase was rather slow, and later it's much higher from one year to another, but that R value, 0.18, has been the same the whole time. So if we were to about another 20 years, we'd all be waist deep in tortoises, or chest deep. They're big animals. Notice
I personally would find that awesome.
Right? Yeah, plenty. notice with this graph that I've used the variables y and x. So once again, when you read graphs and read models, you want to think about what are the variables on the model, which correspond to the axes usually, and what are the parameters of the model. In this case, that R value, 0.1823, is constant the whole time, but it describes this population who's that's growing increasingly fast every year because there are more individuals having babies at the same rate every time. So this model is density independent. What that means is the birth rates and the death rates are not changing as the population size increases. There's no relationship between population density, or you could say population size, but we're talking about population density usually, and these parameter values. So the assumptions that must be met for a population to grow under these conditions is you have to have a stable age structure to the population. So I didn't tell you how old the different tortoises were that were introduced, but mostly they were sexually mature tortoises, so they were ready to start reproducing as soon as they colonized. If they had introduced 30 juvenile tortoises that still have another, I don't know, few years to go before they could start reproducing, then that population size wouldn't start increasing until they started reaching sexual maturity and started reproducing. And of course, the other one that we just talked about is that in order for the finite rate of increase to be constant, the values that you use to calculate it, little b and little d, those per capita birth rates and death rates, also have to be constant over time and not changing as n changes. So if we go step away from the tortoises for a moment, can you guys think of any populations that you might expect to have this kind of a growth pattern, this kind of a model would fit well their population growth?
I think bacteria.
And what makes you say bacteria? What are you imagining? That's a good answer.
Bacteria in the lab, though, because if you provide them enough space and food, they would just keep growing like that.
Yeah, good. That's a good answer. Bacteria in the lab is a great answer. Anything else? Any other ideas?
I would say maybe coronavirus. That's what I thought of.
Yeah, that's an interesting example. I hadn't expected anyone to say that. Maybe I should have. I think you would find that if you were to measure the number of virions, so a virus is an individual particle, it probably would have a pattern like this. Although maybe more so if you average it out over maybe all of the United States or only China only portions of China for a certain period. With epidemiology, things get really dynamic because of different places and different connectivity. Remember, one of the ideas here is the potential for interbreeding, and these things are just replicators, and they have a lot of spatial structure that depends on the host, right? It depends on humans. So that's actually a pretty good answer. But I bet we could look at some models to see if it's still fitting that curve. Hopefully we're flattening it, right? Hopefully it's not continuing to increase like this as much. Good, anyone else?
Would human population be one?
Alexa, say that again.
Sorry, human population?
For a little while, people thought this was what we were seeing. This is what Thomas Malthus was afraid of. It turned out that this tangent line that keeps increasing in its slope, that stopped increasing in the 1960s. It's now decreasing. So we are not actually in this model anymore, but it looks like we are because we're still very close to this steepest portion on the right side of the graph that you're seeing here.
And where you are in that graph depends upon what country you're in. So there are some countries that are still growing at an exponential rate, but most industrialized countries are no longer growing in an exponential fashion.
There was someone else who spoke at the same time as Alexis, but I didn't catch who that was.
Yeah, that was me.
Oh yeah. What do you think?
I was gonna say like endangered animals like pandas.
That's the goal. We want endangered animals to grow exponentially. But the challenge is that they're not, right? The challenge is for a lot of endangered animals, their death rates are higher than their birth rates, and they're at risk of extinction. So we're intervening to elevate those birth rates.
Okay.
The other thing that I was thinking some people might say, I don't know if any of you have any, neighbors or family that maybe had involvement in farms. A lot of farmers will do pest control because when they have a crop, there's going to be an abundance of resources for certain pests, for certain insect pests, whether that's aphids or locusts or something else. And those things can have virtually, or at least initially, exponential growth patterns. In fact, the next kind of population growth we're going to talk about is density-dependent population growth, whereas the population size increases, there's more competition, and that can influence the rate of growth. There was a group of researchers for a while that didn't really think that happened very much. It's going to fit pretty well for the tortoises, but there were people who thought that really most populations, especially of insects, grow most of the time in an exponential function and are periodically having their populations destroyed by seasonal changes where they all die from the cold or other major environmental changes and disasters that bring them back to very low populations, and they go exponential, and they never reach a point where density dependence starts to be important. Instead, it's just random things happening in the environment that kind of reset their exponential curves, and that's why we don't live in a world up to our eyeballs of mosquitoes or aphids, for example. In fact, density dependence is pretty widespread, but this model works pretty well for insect pests, especially in crop fields, at least initially. All right. So we sort of touched on this first one already, but do you think that these assumptions of a perfectly even and stable age structure and no immigration or immigration, and what else do we have? Do you think these are realistic assumptions for most populations? And I see some heads shaking. Why not? What do you think about when you think about populations growing that might not fit this model? Actually, Daniel gave us a good example already of one not fitting this model, right? Population in decline. When you think of an endangered species, what are some of the reasons that a species might be endangered?
They aren't wanting to mate.
That seems to be an issue with the pandas. Presumably, if they were in good conditions in their environment, where their natural behaviors match their environment, they would want to mate because there are pandas. So under certain conditions, they do mate. We're just having trouble replicating those. Any others?
Poaching?
Yeah, poaching, which is essentially predation by humans, or at least the effect of it is similar to intense predation. What else?
Being outcompeted.
Outcompeted, so that could be what kinds of species might outcompete an organism that is in one set of conditions quite successful, going along just fine, and then suddenly is declining and becoming endangered.
Invasive species taking over.
Yeah, it turns out that with most invasive species, it's the predators that tend to drive things to negative population growth and towards extinction. And it's less often competitors, at least in the case of plants. It tends to be more often predation that can drive things all the way to extinction, although competition does affect population growth rates and population size for sure.
Yeah, and in the case of the tortoises, it was a combination of predation from humans and then predation from things like rats that would dig up nests and things like that. So they were getting hit by a couple of introduced predators, if you want to think of humans as an introduced predator, which you can.
Yeah. And there's one more. There's one more that I was thinking you guys might hit on that might explain a population not growing exponentially. Another reason that some species are in decline.
Their habitat could be being destroyed.
Yeah. And so that falls under the broad umbrella of land use change, right? So there's areas of land where there are species, and if we change the habitat by converting it to agriculture or over-harvesting or any other way that we might change the way the land is used, then that can remove habitat and remove resources and lead to population decline. But remember, that population decline is manifested in these values B and D. So what's likely to happen to B over time as a population continues to grow under an exponential population growth model? What do you think might happen to that B value? If this looks unrealistic to you for most species. I don't know about you guys, but my great-grandmother, so I'm part German, and my great-grandmother on the German side was given an award for having so many children in Germany. But my father had one child. I'm the only one. So what's happened? Well, same is true for my mother. She's not German, but she had one child. So what's happened to the per person or per mother birth rate over time?
It's decreased.
Yeah, right? So the B can decline over time if populations get really large. And what about the death rate? You guys were already thinking about competition. This maybe is a little more intuitive. What could happen to the death rate as a population gets really, really large?
Increases.
Yeah, good. So if you have a birth rate and a death rate that are changing as the population size gets larger and larger, that describes density dependence. And that's what our next population growth lecture is going to be on. So how might this curve look if the island couldn't support 12,000 tortoises, but could only support 100 tortoises, and they started with 30? Any predictions of what that might look like?
It would probably flatten out really quick.
Yeah, it would probably flatten out, maybe reach a plateau. And often we describe these kinds of curves as having a bit of an S shape to them, like a stretched out S. So they start out slow, they get steep right around here, and then they get shallow again. And when I'm talking about steepness and shallowness, I'm visualizing that tangent line as you move along here. Right? So imagine how that tangent line is fluctuating. Here it's always getting steeper and steeper and steeper forever. Here it gets steeper initially and then shallows out again. All right, so you guys have a homework assignment that goes over some of this stuff to really make sure you get a sense of what all these different variables mean. Let me unshare the screen here. Me, please. There we go. Okay, I should be back now. You guys see me or do you see PowerPoint? Okay, good. All right, so you have a homework assignment that goes over this, this model of exponential population growth, and we're going to continue with density-dependent population growth in a few class periods. We're going to go back to natural selection, I believe it is. But what I want to do is I want to end with considering the relationship between this growth model, this exponential growth model, and evolution by natural selection. Could natural selection occur in a population that's growing exponentially? And maybe to get at that question again, who can remind me of the premises of evolution by natural selection? I want you guys to get practice and really know these. What are those premises? Anyone have any of them from memory, or are you looking them all up?
Natural selection could definitely occur in a population growing like this.
Why do you think so?
I don't know. I'm just guessing, to be honest.
So let's see if we can land either there or at the alternative answer. What has to happen? Remind me what has to happen for natural selection to occur.
Variation. Variation's correlated with fitness.
Anybody want to help out with this?
More organisms have to be like being produced and that can survive.
And the trait has to be heritable.
Yeah. So usually in studies, in the kind of studies that we're going to be dealing with, you can get away with the assumption of heritability. Now, how heritable something is worth investigating, and we will do that. But these are all organisms all the organisms we're going to talk about reproduce sexually and transmit the genetic information vertically. So their traits are, most traits that vary that we're going to talk about are heritable in the sense that we mean when we talk about the premises of natural selection. So that one we're going to check off for the tortoises. What about variation? Do you guys think there's probably variation in the tortoises? I think that's a reasonable assumption if you know something about populations of animals. They're like us, right? We're all a little bit different here on this Zoom call. So if this was a Zoom call of tortoises, it would be effectively the same. Everyone would be a little different. What about the other two, fitness consequences and survival? So in this population growth model where the growth rate is increasing faster and faster as time goes on, or as the population size is increasing faster and faster as time goes on, do you know whether the organisms are reproducing to their fullest potential? What do you know about their reproduction?
That it's happening at an exponential rate.
And what does that mean about the capital R value, or the finite rate of increase value? If we go back to the little table that we filled out here, what do you know about this parameter? Which category are we in here? You guys had greater than, less than, and equal to.
It's greater than.
Yeah. So you know that this finite rate of increase value is greater than 1, and so the population size is growing, and that's why the curve goes up. So you know the population growth rate is positive. You know that per individual there are many births every year, or the population is growing, but you don't actually know if every individual born survives and reproduces to its fullest amount. An egg clutch of a tortoise might be 12 eggs or something. I don't know exactly the number, but there's going to be some average number. That doesn't mean that every tortoise is laying its full clutch every year, and that all of those baby tortoises are surviving. It just means the population growth is positive.
Yeah, let me see if I can kind of clarify a little bit what Dr. Judd is trying to say. Sometimes when I see people teach about population growth in the context of natural selection, they teach that natural selection is less likely if you have an exponentially growing population. But all the exponential growth means is that you're having way more births than deaths. But the fact that you're having deaths means that not everybody who's born survives. It's just that a lot more of them are surviving than are dying. So there's still the possibility of selection happening, assuming that then that death is related to their phenotype.
That's the last point, the last premise we were going to get back to. Is like, why are they dying? If those deaths are related to a heritable phenotypic trait that matters for the population, then you can still get evolution by natural selection, right? Now, if we're talking about those aphids in a crop field and they're dying because you're spraying insecticide on them, that's not going to provide a whole lot of room for selection if all of the aphids are equally susceptible to the pesticide. So under those conditions, you're not going to get much evolution by natural selection unless there's some variation in the population that evolves or that appears that allows some aphids to survive and be resistant. Then you'll get selection for aphids that are resistant, and their population is going to grow exponentially because they're not going to be competing with all the dead aphids that were susceptible. Make sense? So that's where that idea that natural selection might be weaker in an exponentially growing population. But really what matters is why organisms are dying, whether there's variation that influences the deaths. And of course, when you get to exponential growth rates, or this model, and you're in the sort of the flattening portion of the curve, then the number of deaths, relative number of births is increasing, and still the reason for death will matter. So we'll come back to this model, and we'll go through the math of that at a later time. But you've got homework, and that's all I had for today. Paul, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, Nathan, since you're kind of here, and you kind of mentioned something similar to this when you mentioned the whole aphid example, were you planning on showing them the Harvard megaplate?
Oh yeah, I was, and I just didn't load that.
Another way of thinking about the megaplate, so are you going to load that up on your computer
I will.
and then share your screen? Yeah, so another way of thinking of this Harvard megaplate study is that these bacteria are growing on a medium that has increasing levels of antibiotics in the media. And you'll see the bacteria grow across the surface of this media, and then when they get to the boundary where they're going from low concentration to higher concentration, all of a sudden they stop. And it's because they're finally hitting this thing where now more of them are dying than are living. But the ones that do live have a phenotype that allows them to then handle that increased level of antibiotic concentration. So what you could envision this thing doing from a population growth standpoint is exponential growth until you hit that boundary, at which point exponential growth stops because you're now having death due to the presence of antibiotics, followed by the strains that have the genetic mechanisms for dealing with those antibiotics, then start a period of exponential growth as they grow across the plate. They hit another boundary, et cetera, et cetera. And Dr. Judd is going to show you the video. It's a really nice example of evolution via natural selection in action. Over a really short period of time, I think it was about 11 days that they ran this experiment.
I think I've got it up here. Let's see if I can successfully share. Desktop 2.
We normally present it just in the context of natural selection, but you can also see population growth in it as well.
Okay. I think I got past all the commercials, so this should just work.
Awesome.
You guys seeing that?
So what we ended up building was basically a petri dish, except that it's 2 feet by 4 feet. And the way we set it up is that there are 9 bands, and at the base of each of these bands, we put a normal Petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band has 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it, pour some thin agar that bacteria can move around in. The background is black because there's ink in it, and the bacteria appear as white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic, up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right. It's resistant to the antibiotic, it spreads, until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it into 10 times as much antibiotic. Then you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive. And so we can see by this process of accumulating successive mutations that bacteria, which are normally sensitive to an antibiotic, can evolve resistance to extremely high concentrations in a short period of time.
I can post the link to that on Moodle if any of you want to take a look at that again later. What's worth noting, remembering about it is that, remember, the bacteria aren't, they don't know about the environment in a way that they make decisions about adapting to it. It's something that happens as a consequence of mutations. If you were to take one of those bacteria that was highly resistant and grow it in the same place as one that was not very resistant in a place that lacked any antibiotic, likely the less resistant one would probably grow faster. There's probably some consequences, some trade-off to being antibiotic resistant, such that you win if you're in the presence of it, but don't necessarily win in a competition game if you're not in the presence of that antibiotic. So just to think about the voice that we use when we talk about the evolution of traits that allow them to exploit new habitats, even if that's a plate of agar that's just got higher antibiotic concentrations. It's something that happens passively, basically, as a consequence of mutations and the accumulation of variation in different contexts.
Yeah, because there's a little bit of unfortunate language in there, because he says at the boundary point they have to develop a mutation. Well, that kind of makes it seem like the bacterium is trying to do something. Mutation happens, that mutation leads to variation, and then those variants that can handle the higher antibiotic load, those are then the ones that can move into that new environment.
Any questions about that or about the population growth slides? All right, then we'll see you guys on Friday.
Hey, Katie. Oh, she's gone.
Okay.
I was going to tell Katie, I don't care what she does to my family member. I'm not paying the ransom.